Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar titled Strengthening Research Integrity, Which Areas Should the Research Community Focus on? This webinar is organized jointly by the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences and the American Society for Nutrition. My name is Brianna Lerck, and I'm a Scientific Program Manager at the Institute for Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences, also known as IFANS. For those who aren't familiar, IFANS is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that engages scientists from academia, government, and industry to advance food safety and nutrition sciences in support of public health. We believe that including diverse perspectives is fundamental to the development of rigorous, credible science, and we carry out all of our initiatives and projects in accordance with our core values of scientific integrity, transparency, collaboration, and public benefit. Today's webinar will consist of two parts, a presentation of a recent study published in Nature on strengthening research integrity, followed by a moderated panel discussion on the same topic. Our goal for this session is to have a dialogue and engage directly with the audience. So if you have questions or comments for the speakers, we encourage you to submit them at any time in the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. With that, it is an honor to introduce the moderator of this webinar, Dr. Johanna Dwyer. Johanna is a professor of medicine at Tufts University's School of Medicine, senior nutrition scientist at the John Mayer USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging, and director of the Francis Stern Nutrition Center at Tufts Medical Center. Johanna is a senior nutrition scientist contractor at the NIH Office of Dietary Supplements as well. Her work has chiefly involved large clinical trials of diet in health and disease, and she has about 400 publications to her name. In addition to her work as a scholar and clinician, her interests in public policy and specifically nutrition policy have led to extensive involvement and assignments in Washington, D.C., several of which involve committees and publications on scientific integrity. Johanna has been active in several professional associations, serving as past president and secretary of the predecessors to the American Society for Nutrition. She has served on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee and the Food and Nutrition Board of the National Academy of Sciences. Johanna is a member and former counselor of the National Academy of Medicine. And with that, thank you for joining us today, Johanna, and I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Brianna. It's great. As you mentioned, this session is going to consist of a presentation by Dr. Sorensen, followed by a panel discussion on the topic of strengthening research integrity. And so I'll introduce Dr. Sorensen now and our two additional panelists at the beginning of the panel discussion. You can see on this slide my and Dr. Sorensen's disclosure, and we'll share those with the other panelists as soon as they're introduced later in the webinar. As a reminder, because we do want this to be interactive, please, if you've got questions for the speakers at any time, please enter them in the questions box on the GoToWebinar platform. And it's down on the right-hand side of that control panel. Well, with no more ado, let me introduce Dr. Mads Sorensen and thank him particularly for coming because he's got a bad cold. So we're going to give him a break for coughing and drinking some water whenever he needs it. Dr. Sorensen is the senior researcher at the Danish Center for Studies in Research and Research Policy in the Department of Political Science at Aarhus University in Denmark. And he's co-coordinator of a very large European Union project called Standard Operating Procedures for Research Integrity. It's a 4-year Horizon 2020 project with 13 partners in 10 different countries. So he's got a lot to share about that. He's also got a background of many years of work in the history of ideas, and he's a specialist in social theory and quantitative research methods. Currently, his research interests include research integrity, key concepts and ideas in research policy driving toward excellence, the changing conditions of knowledge production, non-knowledge, I guess what we call it in the States is fake facts, Risk Society and Modernity and Social Theory. He's published many articles and books and on these topics. So Mads, welcome, and thank you so much for sharing your recent study with us. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Johanna, for this kind introduction and for the invitation also to participate in this event. I will try to share my screen.
Yes, your screen is up and it looks good.
My screen is up. Thank you. So, as Johanna said, I have a bit of a cold, so let's see how I get through this. I hope I'll be able to do my presentation as planned. Oh, sorry. So I'm going to talk about a paper that we published recently called Strengthening Research Integrity, Which Topics Areas Should Organizations Focus On? I published this with 6 colleagues of mine from this research project that Johanna was talking about earlier. I will talk about this paper, but I will also talk about the bigger project and also about how this particular paper and this study fits into the overall project. This paper reports on a rather large focus group study that we did with 30 focus groups interviews across 8 countries in Europe. Focusing on the topics of which research integrity topics researchers and stakeholders would recommend that research performing organizations and research funding organizations focus on. So which areas, which topics should they prioritize in their work when they want to do something good for research integrity? So this is the study. I'll come back to the details later. Just here are the partners in our bigger projects in the Sub-3 project, 13 partners in 10 countries. It's coordinated, this project, by my colleague Niels Meilgaard and myself at Aarhus University. But we are maybe 30-35 people all in all in the project. We are funded for 4 years by the European Union. We started in 2019, and we have 1 year left in the project. The background for this project is are the problems we have seen with research integrity over the last years. There's been, over the last 20 years, we've talked a lot about spectacular research misconduct cases, scientific fraud of all sorts, but also other detrimental practices that we normally call questionable research practices, QRPs. Together, they have created problems for the reliability of scientific results. And again, this can of course be damaging for research in general, for the scientific system, if the public and other researchers start losing trust in our institutions and in the results that we create in our institutions. So we have to do something about this. This was the starting point for our project. And one of the things that has been done already is the publication of a number of code of conducts, national code of conducts within particular fields of research. But also this one is particularly important in Europe, the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity. The second edition of it came in 2017. And what is common for these documents is that they outline a number of principles that we have to think about if we want to do responsible research. So The ALEA Code of Conduct, the European Code of Conduct, talk about 4 key principles: reliability, honesty, respect, and accountability. But sometimes it can be difficult to translate that into the actual research practice at the shop floor of our research institution. So the question is then, how do we come from these principles to practice, to actual practice in our institutions? So here we believe that we shouldn't focus only or entirely on the single researcher, but we also have to focus on the institutions. The institutions really have to take responsibility here for the situation that we are in. They have to do more, and we think that both research performing organizations, but also funders, have a role to play. We think that the bridge between these codes of conduct and actual responsible conduct of research in the institutions is what we call a research integrity promotion plan, a RIP, or you could also just say a research integrity plan. We believe that all RPOs and all RFOs should have such a RIP, and that in this RIP they should outline the steps that they're going to take to promote research integrity. Of course, they should also take into consideration what kind of an institution they are, their mission, and their particular disciplinary focus. But basically, this RIP should address a number of research integrity topics, and it should outline policies for how these topics will be handled. So that's kind of the core idea in our project in SUBS4I. What we then work on in the project is defining the topics that should be addressed by the RFOs and the RPOs in their RIPs, and we also create a free online toolbox that you can find on this web address, where you will be able to find guidelines for all the topics, but also the themes or the subtopics that are covered by the single topics. We are collecting existing material that have a sufficiently high quality and including that in our toolbox, but we're also creating new guidelines in areas where there are no guidelines so far. In the toolbox, well, I can say that the toolbox will keep developing over the next year, but already now we have over 80 tools in our toolbox, so please check it out at some point. We will also include a guideline for how to make a RIP in the toolbox, together with templates for that you can use for writing a RIP. These documents are currently being tested in 10 pilot institutions that have volunteered to test our tools, and as soon as we have the next version of them, we will also put them online. And then we also include some best practice examples in our toolbox. So this is the project, and the way we work with it is through a quite comprehensive empirical program where we do research and where we also do co-creation activities with stakeholders within the area. We started with some scoping reviews, a Delphi survey, and some expert interviews to find out what's already out there, but also to define, to have a first list of topics that we needed to address in our toolbox and that institutions need to address. We then continued examining these topics and also the guidelines we have found in focus group interviews. For the areas where we didn't find any guidelines, we then had some extensive co-creation activities with stakeholders to come up to formulate guidelines within these areas. We've had a massive survey out to in over 30 countries. Over 50,000 researchers have responded. The results haven't been published yet, but that will happen very soon. And then now we are in the process of pilot testing our toolbox and our ideas in these institutions. But back to the focus group study, which then, as you can see, is placed in cycle 2 here. What we had to work with as the basis in our focus group study was the topics that that came out of the Delphi survey. So the experts that took part in the Delphi survey, they pointed to 11 topics that RFOs should focus on, and 9 topics that universities and other research institutions should focus on. What they didn't say anything about were disciplinary differences. So, and also the Delphi survey doesn't say anything about, doesn't give you a deep understanding of the single topics. We just knew that these were the topics to focus on. So in the focus group study, we then wanted to understand disciplinary differences in the perception of these topics. We wanted to know more about how different research groups, different fields, main research areas understood these topics, how they wanted to prioritize them, and how relevant they were for their area. We knew beforehand that from the literature that there are big differences, relatively big differences when it comes to research processes, practices, how science is actually carried out, but also in what constitutes scientific knowledge. Knorr Cetina speaks about these epistemic cultures, these different epistemic cultures. We also know, and related to this, that there are differences when it comes to questionable research practices. In some areas, some practices are considered very detrimental. In other areas, they are not. So this is also something we had to take into consideration. So therefore, we expected differences also in the need for research integrity support across disciplines. So the way we then designed the study was that we couldn't do focus group studies within each single discipline. So we instead operated with 4 main areas of research: the humanities, social science, natural science, including technical science, and medical science, including biomedicine. And we focused on how science is done. So we planned 16 groups, 4 times 4 groups, that would focus on research performing organizations. These groups included only researchers from these fields. So 4 groups focused on the humanities, 4 on the social science, and so forth. And in the groups, we then had, for example, in the social sciences, we had 2 groups with people working with qualitative methods and 2 groups with people working with quantitative methods. In the natural sciences, we had a division between people working with theory and people working in labs. And in the medical science groups, we divided the groups between lab groups and clinical translational groups. So 16 groups there, and then we have 16 other groups focusing on what funders should do. You can see that here we also included relevant stakeholders. So people working in funding organizations, people working in research integrity offices, etc. So All in all, 32 groups, and when the coronavirus hit Europe last year, we had done 22 of them, and then suddenly we had to rethink the whole thing. We managed to then swap, do 8 of the remaining 10 groups online. It's not the same, but it's better than not doing any, collecting any data. Only 2 of the groups, 2 groups in the UK, we had to cancel completely. But still, we did 30 focus group interviews, so it's probably still one of the biggest studies that has been done of this kind. And it certainly gave us a lot of material and a lot of things to work with afterwards. So one of the things we did in the focus groups, the way we had built it up, was that we had an exercise, a sorting exercise, a very simple exercise, where we asked them to take, if it was a group, I can see this photo is from a group focusing on RFOs. They had these 11 topics, so we asked them simply to take these topics and to sort them into to these 3 groups. So is this very important for RFOs to focus on, somewhat important, or if not, more minimal importance? And then we also had in-depth discussions of 2 to 3 topics per group. And we had some open questions to find out if there were other topics that we hadn't included so far that were also important to focus on. These, the sorting exercise, together with the deliberations, then made it possible for us to create these heat maps. This is a heat map showing the medical groups what they think the RPOs should focus on. You can see you have the 9 topics that they discussed over here, and then you have the 4 groups we conducted here. You can see a medical science basic research group from Greece, and here's a basic one from Croatia, one from the Netherlands, and one from Denmark. And then we have the combined kind of score over here. The greener it gets, the more important this topic is considered. We could also make heat maps for, so we combined all the 14 groups that we did focusing on RPOs, and you can see that they basically think all the topics that we discussed with them, that they are important or very important. Only 2 of them were thought of as somewhat important, but still important. And if we look at the ones they top prioritize, so that's the ones that they in all groups, or in 3 out of 4 groups, thought were very important. You can see that that's also a lot of topics within all the fields here. And the same picture we get for the RFOs, the 11 topics, almost all of them are important. 2 of them considered somewhat important, the combined score. And also here, a lot of the topics are considered really important to focus on. So I guess what we learned from this was that the topics that we got from the experts from the Delphi survey were actually also in the eyes of researchers and stakeholders considered to be very important topics, and considered to be the topics to focus on. But as you can also see, there are some differences, and I think that that's something to keep in mind when we talk about the knowledge that came out of this. We learned a lot about researchers and stakeholders' understanding of the different RI topics, and they don't necessarily understand them in the same way across the main areas of research. We also learned quite a bit about how RPOs and RFOs can support the different main areas with research integrity guidelines. And a very important thing was that we had to think, after this we were told that you have to think about a work division between the two types of organizations. They shouldn't do exactly the same. There must be some kind of a work division between them. I'll come back to that later. And then we learned something about the need for avoiding unnecessary bureaucracy and too much paperwork, especially the researchers, of course, made us aware of that. It's valuable research time that goes with filling in forms and things like that. So minimize that. Only do the things that are absolutely necessary. Think about national and organizational differences. There are different legislations in different countries, so there's no one size fits all here, and that's also what makes this a bit complicated. And it's the same for disciplinary differences. It may be the same topics that they pointed out as being important, but sometimes they have different needs for content for the same topics. So if you take a thing like authorship guidelines, you couldn't have the same authorship guidelines across main areas of research, because authorships are thought of in a different way within the humanities as within medical science, for example. And within the humanities, if you have more than one author, then you would typically put people in alphabetic order, whereas you in medical science or in natural science would have the most important author first, and the one with the grant, the PI, at the end of the list of authors. So things like that are things we have to think about for all topics. There are differences for most of these topics. And then we also learned something about how exhaustive the topic lists were, and no new topics, as I said, came up in the discussions. But then in our Stop4AI project, we have then worked, coming back to what we have done there. So we have stayed with the 9 topics that we work with for the RPOs. We have presented them in this guideline that you can download from our webpage, and we have also presented it in a commentary in Nature that is co-authored by I guess half of the consortium. And yeah, I'm not going to go into details with all of them, just to give you an idea. So we have the topics to the left here. So for example, the research environment, and ideas for action here would be to ensure fair assessment procedures and prevent hyper-competition, excessive publication pressure. Supervision and mentoring, integrity training also came out as really important in almost all groups. It could be something like create clear guidelines for PhD supervision, or establish training and confidential counseling for all researchers. Ethic structures, establish review procedures that accommodate different types of research and disciplines. So think about, again here, there is no one size fits all here. It doesn't make sense to say that all research projects have to go through ethical review. Then you drown the ethic committees in applications. So think about which ones, where does it make sense, and then don't do them in the areas where it doesn't make sense. So that's something to think about, but have the ethics structures in place in the institution. Integrity breaches, data practices and management, also of course very important things. And then finally, for the RPOs, research collaboration, establish sound rules for transparency when working with industry and international partners. Declaration of interests. An example here would be state conflicts, of course, financial and personal. research, but also in reviews and other professional activities. And then publication and communication. We've talked about authorship guidelines already as an example of what you could focus on here. So that's for the RPOs, and we have now also made one for the RFOs, and I'll end with this one. And it's there we have really merged some of the topics that we tested in the focus group study. We had 11 topics there, and now in our guidelines for what RFOs should focus on, according to our project, we have 6 topics left, and we divide them into external expectations and internal organizations. And it is really this thing about thinking about a work division between RPOs and RFOs that made us do this, because if RPOs already have structures in place, if they already are focusing on the 9 topics that we were talking about earlier, then there's no need for RFOs to start focusing on the same things. But what RFOs could do is, of course, to require that applicants adhere to relevant regulations and code of conduct for research integrity, but also to check or to make it possible for RPOs to show that they are actually working with this. Maybe describe if they have a RIP, describe what they have and what they are doing there. That could be part of the application process. And then, of course, you also have to think about internal organization. Make your assessment procedures transparent. Make it mandatory for grant applicants, but also for reviewers, members of your committees, for IFO staff, to complete a declaration of interest form, and maybe do that once a year or something. Monitor grants, not just the financial side of it, but also some of the research integrity things. And then, of course, also have sound procedures for how you will deal with internal research integrity breaches. Think about, whistleblower things. Think about protecting both the whistleblower and the one accused, as an example. So these are 6 things to think about for IFOs. And with that, I will thank you for your attention. And you can follow the development of our toolbox, and you can read more on our webpage. And there's also 2 links here to the 2 guidelines that we have made. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mads. That was wonderful. We really enjoyed hearing that. And we'll give you a rest now so that you can get some water for your cold. What I'd like to do now is introduce our next 2 speakers. Dr. Kathy Witecki is the first member of our panel. And remember to put your questions into the question box, please. Kathy's the president of the Charles Valentine Riley Memorial Foundation, and she holds positions as professor of food science and human nutrition at Iowa State University, as well as visiting distinguished professor in the Biocomplexity Institute of the University of Virginia. And she served as chief scientist and undersecretary for USDA's REE mission area from 2010 to 2016. And in that role, she did a lot of things. One was to develop the Office of the Chief Scientist. Another was to establish the USDA Science Council. She instituted the first scientific integrity and open data policies at USDA, and was a founding member of the meeting of agricultural chief scientists that were held under the auspices of the G20. Dr. Witecki is an advocate for building the platforms that are needed to enhance domestic and international food and agricultural research. Before she joined USDA this last time, she was Global Director of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs for Mars Incorporated, where she managed the company's science policy on matters of health, nutrition, and food safety. And from 2002 to 2005, she was Dean of Agriculture and also head of the Ag Experiment Station at Iowa State. Dr. Witecki also served earlier as the first Undersecretary for Food Safety at USDA from 1997 to 2001, where she oversaw the safety of meat, poultry, and egg products. So welcome, Kathy. Our other panelist is Dr. Robert Berthelot, who's professor of nutrition at Memorial University in Newfoundland in Canada, and he's been involved in research integrity via his role as president of the Canadian Nutrition Society, as a board member of IFANS, which sponsors this seminar, and as a member of the IFANS Assembly on Scientific Integrity. Rob is also a member of various committees at the American Society for Nutrition, a co-sponsor of this symposium, and including the Implementation Advisory Group of ASN's Trusted Nutrition Science Initiative. So welcome, Rob, and welcome, Kathy. What I'd like to do is lead off with one question that came in, and then go to, we've got 4 or 5 that have come in since then. To both of you, particularly while Mods takes a little rest, are there any research integrity topics that are important to the nutrition community that weren't prioritized in the study you just heard about? Do either of you have anything to say about that? For example, the papers that ASN and IFANS and other leading organizations have published on this same topic.
There is one, Johanna, that I think is worth mentioning, and that is political interference in scientific research. When we developed the scientific integrity policies during the Obama administration across all of the federal science agencies, that was one topic that was included that wasn't included in this study in Europe. And I think that may be understandable, because what we heard from Dr. Sorensen was more focused on research integrity as opposed to a broader scientific integrity set of questions. But this question of political interference becomes, I think, important more so from the perspective of scientists who are working within agencies, either as full-time researchers or as scientists conducting jobs that involve scientific decisions, as opposed to an individual investigator at a research institution working with a grant. So that was one area where I thought that it is included in US policies, but was not considered in this particular study that we're hearing about.
Good point, good point. I think also it does apply in individual institutions. The politics isn't as dramatic as it might be in Washington, but there's still a lot of politics within universities and research communities that also can be interfered with by politics. Rob, did you have any suggestions there?
Yeah, and along the same lines, it's not, I mean, it's definitely, political interference, but it's also maintaining the reputation of science and the broad trust of science, right? I mean, as soon as they decide that science isn't correct or doesn't align with their agenda, then that just creates a distrust in scientists in general. And then you're just picking and choosing which, scientists you want to trust. But the political piece is quite important, and that changes, of course, different governments, but it's quite stark when it does change, and it is quite disturbing. Otherwise, the paper really covered, the research principles that we keep talking about and are critical. I think one other aspect that maybe we zone in on a little more detailed in the nutrition and food realm is is the industry relationship. I know the paper sort of covered that from different approaches and at a higher level, but that is really a touch point in our industry. Because the fact that you're involved in industry or industry funded a piece of research, taints it to the point where you distrust it, and we do have to deal with that at a different level as well.
Thank you. Those are very thoughtful responses. Let me bring up a question that just came in. This is an interesting one. Group A publishes a groundbreaking medical study, and then Group B can't repeat it. So what should Group B do? Should they collaborate with Group A to see how it can be resolved? What should they do? I guess this is for everybody. And you can make it even more interesting by saying it's all, the Group A is the big cheese in the university, and Group B is some little assistant professor.
Well, I think, one of our principles is that we should publish. So Group B should certainly submit their work for peer review and publication. And I think also, along the lines of we endorse collegiality, you should also be reaching out to your colleagues to see what the source of the differences might be, to understand them.
Good. Rob, what about you?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think there's quite a movement now in the publication world, especially with open access, to publish anything that is soundly conducted research, regardless of the outcomes. And I think that's the principle that we probably haven't followed, decades ago, but we're slowly moving towards that. And that because we do know that there's publication bias as well, right? Things that are not published because the results didn't line up is a form of bias that we need to avoid. And I think our entire industry really relies on peer review. And if the peers can't review it, then the whole system doesn't work. And so you really need to make sure that it's out there and discussed openly, and in a collaborative environment, of course. But it has to be out there for us to evaluate it.
Terrific. Mons, did you have any comments on that one? Group A.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very good question, and one of the key problems that so much of what we do cannot be reproduced, and it really hurts us. It hurts. It's also where the trust problem lies. So, I mean, if we produce it and no one can reproduce it, then why trust what comes out of the universities? So we have to do something about that. And I think a key thing here is transparency. So that we should demand of ourselves that we are as transparent as possible when we do things. I mean, it's okay to make mistakes. We can all do that, but make it, make our data as openly available as possible. Our methods, describe them as accurate as possible, so other people can follow them. And yeah, so put everything out there so people can check what we do, not to come after us and to teach us, but because it's a shared effort to take care of our reputation, to take care of what comes out of our institutions. So I think it's all about transparency, being as transparent as possible.
Thank you.
And it's interesting, of our two sponsoring organizations for this webinar today, the IFIN's Scientific Integrity Consortium had published several years ago a set of guidelines for strengthening scientific integrity that along this dimension about this case that you presented, strongly encourages that guidelines be in place for strengthening the peer review process, for publishing unanticipated findings, and for harmonizing retraction and corrections of the literature. So those are all guidelines that are laid out to strengthen scientific integrity in that consortium report.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another one here that's an interesting one. We have about 6, so we've got lots to do. One of the big problems for research integrity is that the incentives for research findings are very much skewed toward finding large positive results, and there's inadequate monitoring of these issues. And I think the question is to Mads, do your guidelines address these incentives? And I guess we could ask that also of the others.
Yeah, so I think so. Our first topic, so focusing on the research community, on the reward system within your institution, on promotions, and on this sometimes often insane publication pressure that people are under, and also this over focusing on the big journals, on the journal impact factor, on all the metrics here. That doesn't help research integrity. It's not, of course, we should do high quality research, but high quality research is not just what is published in high journals with a high impact factor. So that there's a lot we have to do, and it's not easy to fix, because there's a long history of giving grants to people who have certain types of publications, giving professorships and other permanent positions to people who have published in the right journals. So, but that's something we need to think about if we want to create a sound environment where we can actually focus on doing high quality research.
Thank you. Here's another one for you, Mads, if your voice is still with you.
Yeah.
Do your categories of competing interests include anything more than financial interests? Academic views, publication histories, and personal views, the questioner says, are likely stronger influences than a grant or consulting fee in some cases.
Yes, I completely agree, and they do. It's about declaring interest and handling conflicts of interest in relation to funding, peer review, evaluation, assessments, promotions, collaborations, etc. So I completely agree. It's not just about financial things. It's also about saying, like, I cannot review this, or I can review it, but you have to know that I'm actually in a competing group. So that might be important to know when you get my assessment of this. Yeah. So yeah.
Here's one for everybody. These are great questions. Someone's promoted to a high level at a university. It then becomes clear that several papers were suspect. Should the promotion be retracted?
Well, that's the kind of question that the institution has to take in, step up to and review. So I think there are within institutions situations that occur like that, and yes, they need to be looked into.
Good enough. Here's another one. Many studies can't be reproduced exactly due to lack of sufficient details in publications. And in part, this is because of page limits. Should we try to increase all details and methods and analyses as a requirement for research integrity? Or, and I'll add to this question because I edit a journal, are there other ways we can do this, like appendices that aren't published but that are available? Anybody have any ideas on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's changing. I mean, back in the print days, page limits was a real, barrier. But I think now, with online printing, they still do have print limits or page limits, just because you want to not read too much. But the supplemental material now that's attached is almost required, and you're not only depositing, the details of the methods and maybe the protocols, but also a lot of the raw data. And I think we're moving in that direction quite quickly. So I don't, I can see that changing. I think we're moving in the right direction with that process.
Anybody else, Raymond?
No, I completely agree. I think that has changed to the better over the last years. You can add all this supplementary material, but you can also use things like the open science framework. You can pre-register your study, and you can put in, you can add supplementary material there. You can add data and transcripts and what you have there. I think this is a real improvement. Yeah.
Here's one, just a quickie on publishing as well. The person says it's important for scientific and validity that confirmatory studies also be published, but that's often not what interests the journal editors. And so that's a question, I guess, that the journal editors would need to answer. How do we get more of those papers published, or at least into the journals?
Yeah, and I think that was certainly part of what motivated the Scientific Integrity Consortium's guideline that relates to encouraging the publication of unanticipated findings, largely negative results, yes.
Here's another one about multidisciplinary studies, and I think it's for everybody, this question. As nutrition studies become more multidisciplinary and involve more diverse funders, what challenges, if any, do you foresee, and what needed changes might there be in scientific integrity principles? Anybody have any thoughts?
Yeah, at least from the U.S. perspective, since 2000, the definition of research misconduct across all of the federal science agencies that are sponsoring extramural research, as well as those that are conducting intramural research, is the same. And although there might be slight differences in the procedures for how, when an allegation of research misconduct is brought forward, how that would be managed within an agency process, there's been an attempt to harmonize them across the science agencies to the fullest extent that they can. So I think at least that partially addresses the concern within the question about multidisciplinary research that may be funded by two or more agencies in a program.
Good point.
Can I add to that? Because I think this is so. This is the way science is moving. We get more and more transdisciplinary research, and that is good in many ways. But of course, it's also challenging. And I think it's very important that we upfront talk about our mutual expectations between the different disciplines that participate in these projects. Just a simple thing that often causes a lot of problems are these different authorship cultures within the different disciplines. And that's really something to think about and talk about upfront. If possible, make a publication plan, talk about what constitutes an authorship. There are, of course, guidelines for this, but they are mainly for medical science, for the harder sciences. And if you have people from the humanities or from the qualitative parts of social science in a project as well, they probably have a completely different idea about what constitutes an authorship. So it's something to really be aware of and talk about before you run into the problems. That how are we going to do this? What are we going to publish? Who's going to participate in this publication? So I think it's about being aware that disciplines are different and there are different epistemic cultures, and so you need to talk a lot about it upfront before you start doing your research.
Here's a wonderful question, though. It's a graduate student, and oh boy, do I remember this. A graduate student is told to include as a guest author on a work for which the guest author made no contribution. I think many of us have been there.
Yeah, exactly what I was talking about. In some disciplines, that's kind of, you get an authorship there, I'll get one there. You make these deals, and people kind of live with that. In other disciplines, it's unheard of, and so it's it's not so easy.
No, and I think a lot of journals are sort of clamping down on that. They have instructions on which, what your role is, and you have to describe what your role is. But even granting agencies now require you to describe your role in multi-author papers, and your percentage contribution and things like that. So they don't weigh, each paper the same. You do have to explain some of those things. So they're starting to address those kinds of things.
It's astounding what some people think their contributions were, I have to say. It's unbelievable. Let's see what else we have. We've got one here. Would not accepting studies that showed no change or negative results for publications be considered a violation of scientific integrity?
So I think so. Like the way I think we're trying to move towards is just making sure that if a study is done correctly, soundly, using basic principles, and the design is and the results are captured, it doesn't matter what the results are at the end. They are what they are. And I think that that's the basic principle that most journals need to arrive at. And I think we're moving in that direction. So, a lot of journals, used to pride themselves on a 20% acceptance rate, to maintain a impact factor. But I think that is slowly changing. I think you see a lot of journals that are adopting the philosophy of a 60, 70%, acceptance rate, just because that's, if the study is done correctly, that's all you really should be judging it on. We can discuss interpretation of those results, but if the study was done right, it should be publishable.
Let me just throw in one other question that came up because I binged on Turkey this weekend because it's Thanksgiving, but I also binged on Netflix and saw all of Charité. If you've ever seen the history of the Charité Hospital in Berlin, and Robert Koch, who was famous for many things, had a little slip there in terms of research integrity that you can look on. But the basic point is it's good to have research integrity policies, but unless people know about them and what to do if they encounter a problem, it's useless without training. And what kinds of trainings should universities and research organizations have around research integrity, particularly when it becomes the big cheese who's been making some of the problems?
Well, let me start in responding to that. I think it's enormously important that institutions have regular training on research misconduct as well as the broader issues of scientific integrity. And that training really needs to be tailored to people at different stages of their careers. Because the example, for example, that you gave of the graduate student being told to include an author, they need to know what to do in cases like that. But when you begin mentoring, there are other aspects of scientific integrity that, as well as tools for how to do that mentoring, that would be important. And when you move into overall administrative responsibilities, there are another set of issues and skills that you have to learn. So I think we need to get more sophisticated in our research integrity training and start really gearing it for different career stages.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that, you know, when we train graduate students, it seems to be the easier end of things because you're catching them early. It's often the senior researchers, you know, or middle researchers that are, or young researchers even, who are trying to establish their careers that you're not capturing with those kinds of systems, right? Because it's too late for them. But I think that there's a lot of, you know, there's examples of things that have been adopted, you know, successfully. And the one example I know in Canada, I imagine it's in other wells, is the whole concept of equality, diversity, and inclusion. I mean, that has really taken over a lot of our grant writing. I mean, we have to address that issue not only in the conduct of our research, but also in our lab complement and, you know, who we interact with. And so every grant now, you have to write a section on addressing that. And just the fact that you have to think about it and address it means, you know, you're training yourself. But the fact that it's a required part of a lot of these grants really, you know, that could be a way, for example, that they adopt these things. I mean, the other way is with papers. I mean, we still have to submit, you know, we still have to acknowledge animal ethics or human ethics approvals. You know, that there's no one authority for that. I mean, there's thousands of those authorities, but we acknowledge that they all follow the same basic principles, and we have to make sure that our grants are linked to these things, and it has to be in the publications. And the fact that you're thinking about these things all the time helps train ourselves and require us to do it. I know it's extra bureaucracy, but it does work. You learn about these things as you have to do them, right? Not because you're not voluntarily. So.
But also one extra thing one could add was that it's very good to have these ombuds persons in the university, so people that so that everybody knows who to approach if you see something that is not good, or if you encounter a dilemma you're in, something where you can go in like a confidential room where you can talk about these things. And then I also agree that it's a continuous process. It's not just something for when we give the PhD students a research integrity course and then that's it. It's something that we also have to come back to as more seniors again and again, and maybe also have places where we can exchange experiences. We can talk about, also we all encounter these situations where we, where we need to talk to colleagues about what is the right thing to do here. And so it's very important that we have these rooms, and that there is a culture, that we build a culture where it's okay to talk about these things. The worst thing that can happen is that we just sweep it under the carpet and continue. So also there, it's about openness, an open, friendly environment. Yeah.
One of the questions that was raised is about power differentials and also addressing those. But I think, Brianna, do you need to close up?
Yeah, I do want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I think this is a good spot to end it on.
Very good. Thank you so much, Mads, Rob, and Kathy, and Brianna, who made it all possible by her excellent organization. Take care.
Thank you, and to ASN
Thanks,
for
everybody.
co-organizing this session.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Get well,
everyone.
Mads.